Chutz La'aretz, today would be known as Isru Chag, the day after Yom Tov, and yesterday was our Isru Chag here in Eretz Yisrael, unless you kept 2 days. And I want to talk a little bit about Isru Chag. The word Isru Chag literally means to tie to the holiday. The notion of something, in fact, the word asur, forbidden, actually means to be tied up. When we say in Birchos HaShachar, Matir Asurim, that doesn't mean that God allows the prohibited. I'll tell you a story about that. But it means that people who are tied up, people who are imprisoned, people who are in trouble. Now, the truth is, in the time of Shabtai Tzvi, when that crazy Messianic era was trying to say you don't have to keep the Torah anymore, when they would say the bracha Matir Asurim, they would have kavana, oh, Baruch Hashem, God has permitted all that is prohibited. Chazer and Shabbos, all of those things are mutter. But asurim means to be tied up. So asur is to be tied up. Mutar literally means to be released. Mutar. So as a result, Isru Chag means something that is tied to the holiday. That the day after Yom Tov still has a certain kedusha, a certain aura, and therefore it has the holiness of the holiday. Isru Chag. Now, the derivation of the words or the phrase Isru Chag is from Hallel, and there it actually meant something else. What does it say? We say at the end of Hallel, from Tehillim, Kel Hashem, God is our God, V'yoyer lanu, He gives us light. Isru Chag b'avaisim, tie the Chag with ropes, al karnos hamizbeach, on the corners of the altar. Now there, the word Chag in that pasuk does not mean holiday. It means the korbanos that you bring on the Chag, and you tie it up to bring it to be able to transport it to the Mizbeach. Actually, it doesn't mean you tie it to the Mizbeach, but you tie it to bring it to the Mizbeach. So really, in that pasuk is talking about korbanos. That pasuk is not talking about the day after a Yom Tov. But nevertheless, we borrow the phrase, and we use the phrase for Isru Chag, the day after a Yom Tov. Now, every one of the Shalosh Regalim has an Isru Chag. There's an Isru Chag of Pesach, there's an Isru Chag of Sukkot, Shmini Atzeres, and there's an Isru Chag of Shavuos. But it's interesting that lahalacha, the Isru Chag of Shavuos is actually more important than the Isru Chag of Pesach and the Isru Chag of Sukkot. Me'ikar hadin, one does not recite Tachanun on the Isru Chag of Shavuos, although one would recite Tachanun on the Isru Chag of Pesach or the Isru Chag of Shavuos. Now, Lamaisa, because of various minhagim, you're never going to see this difference, because number one, the minhag bizman hazeh, which is later, is we don't say Tachanun the whole month of Nisan. So Memela, after Pesach, you're not going to say Tachanun for the rest of the month. And similarly, at least in Yerushalayim, the minhag is that we don't recite Tachanun for the whole month of Tishrei from the time of Rosh Hashanah onwards, so we don't recite it for the whole week after Sukkot. And even for Shavuos, as you know now, the minhag is we don't recite it for 6 days after Shavuos. So the minhagim here have changed everything. But in terms of the strict halacha, it is only the Isru Chag of Shavuos that is Pater Mitachanun. It is more important than the Isru Chag of Pesach and Sukkot. Now, why would that be so? Why would the Isru Chag of Shavuos be more important? So I'll give you 2 answers. One answer is actually based on the idea that, I'm not sure if I discussed it here or not, but there was a share I gave on Shavuos, that the emes is the Torah was actually not given on Shavuos. The Torah was given the day after Shavuos. The Torah was given on the 51st day of the Omer. Memela, at least in Eretz Yisrael, Isru Chag of Shavuos is the day of Matan Torah itself. And that's why it has a certain chashivas. But that would only be a teretz for the Isru Chag in Eretz Yisrael. That wouldn't be a teretz for the Isru Chag in Chutz La'aretz. But once again, once in Eretz Yisrael, the Isru Chag has a chashivas, so we make a low plug, and we apply that to Eretz Yisrael as well. But the Magen Avraham gives another answer. Again, the question is, what is so important about the Isru Chag of Shavuos? So says the Magen Avraham, the Isru Chag of Shavuos is called Yom Tavoach. the day of slaughter. We know that for each of the shalosh regalim, a man at least, is mechuyev to bring a korban olah. You have to go to the Beis HaMikdash. You have to physically enter the courtyard, right? And you bring with you an animal that is sacrificed as an olah, a burnt offering. That's called an olas re'iyah. Now, you only have to bring one olas re'iyah, and you have 7 days to bring it, meaning on Pesach, you can bring it any one of the 7 days except for Shabbos. For Sukkot, you can actually bring it 8 days. You can even bring it on Shemini Atzeret. And Shavuos, interestingly enough, even though Shavuos is only a one-day holiday, you do have 7 days. You have Shavuos plus 6 days, except for Shabbos. So, Yom Tavoach, the Magen Avraham says, was the first opportunity that people could bring their olas re'iyah because it was not Yom Tov. I'll explain that. Meaning, if you think about it, any other Israelhag, you could never bring the olas re'iyah. The Israelhag of Pesach is after Pesach, so you can't bring the olas re'iyah. The Israelhag of Sukkot is after Shmini Atzeret, so you can't bring the olas re'iyah. The only Israelhag which you would be able to bring the olas re'iyah would be the Israelhag of Shavuos, because you have 7 days and the Israelhag is after the first day. So because the Israelhag of Shavuos was a designated day for the bringing of an olas re'iyah, it has a greater kedusha and a greater sanctity than any other Israelhag where you could not bring the olas re'iyah at all. This is what the Magen Avraham says. The Shulchan Aruch Harav, now the Shulchan Aruch Harav, which Chabad calls the Shulchan Aruch, but it's Shulchan Aruch Harav, was a revision of the Shulchan Aruch that was written by the Baal HaTanya, the Alter Rebbe, Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadeh. Now, if you're a Chabad person, that becomes your main source of halacha. But it's important to know, if you don't already know, that the Shulchan Aruch Harav, or sometimes it's called the Shulchan Aruch Hagrashaz, Hagon Rav Shneur Zalman, is a very, very, very important source of halacha among all poskim. The Mishnah Berurah, we don't always paskin like it, but the Mishnah Berurah will quote it many, many times. Every Sefer Halacha, every posek deals with the Shulchan Aruch Harav. So, number one, it is a major source of psak halacha. Number two, there's a special maila in the Shulchan Aruch Harav that if you want to understand halacha, people don't utilize it as a resource. It's a very beautiful hasbara to explain the halacha. So even if you don't follow the bottom line, he will give you the background and the hezber in the halacha. So if you haven't ever looked at it, looking at the Shulchan Aruch Harav is a worthwhile thing to do. In fact, many editions of the Mishnah Berurah, you'll notice, will be augmented with psakim of the Chazain Ish, and then it'll say Im Shulchan Aruch Harav, like two different poskim that they often augment Mishnah Berurah with. But okay, but be it as it may, the Shulchan Aruch Harav asks the kasha on the Magen Avraham. So again, what does the Magen Avraham say? The Magen Avraham says that the maila of the Israelhag of Shavuos is it was the major day where people brought the olas re'iyah. It is therefore called Yom Tavoach, and any other Israelhag you couldn't have brought the olas re'iyah. Therefore, it has a certain chashivas. Frekt the Shulchan Aruch Harav, that is only true according to Beit Shammai. That is not true according to Beis Hillel. What's going on? We have a big machlokas, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, in Maseches Peah. Are you allowed to bring an olas re'iyah on Yom Tov, or do you have to wait until after Yom Tov? Here is what Beit Shammai says. Beit Shammai says you're only allowed to do malacha on Yom Tov for food preparation. So Beit Shammai says you're allowed to bring a peace offering on Yom Tov, because a peace offering, you shecht it, and part of the meat you're going to eat. So that's called ochel nefesh. But Beit Shammai says a korban olah, every part of the olah is burnt on the Mizbeach. There is no human consumption. So Beis Shammai says, amazingly, even though bringing an olas re'iyah is a mitzvah, you cannot bring it on Yom Tov itself. You have to wait, let's say for Pesach, you'd have to wait for Chol HaMoed. And for Sukkot, you'd have to wait for Chol HaMoed. And for Shavuos, you'd have to wait till Israelhag. Because you're not allowed to bring an olas re'iyah, this is Beis Shammai, you're not allowed to bring an olas re'iyah on Yom Tov because it's not called ochel nefesh. Now, let me just step back for a moment. You do have to understand one thing. It is certainly not Beis Shammai's position that you can't bring any olah on Yom Tov. When something is a korban tzibor, a communal offering that is brought on behalf of the Jewish people, not only does it override Yom Tov, it even overrides Shabbos. For example, the korban tamid was brought on Shabbos, even though what type of korban is the korban tamid? It's an olah. And anyway, even if you'd eat it, you can't cook on Shabbos. A musaf is brought on Shabbos and Yom Kippur. Lighting the menorah occurs on Shabbos and Yom Kippur. And burning incense occurs on Shabbos and Yom Kippur. In fact, it's lucky these guys who throw rocks, don't have a Beis HaMikdash. They probably come into the Beis HaMikdash and start throwing rocks. I mean, Chil Shabbos, you're shechting animals and burning incense and lighting menorah. What has the Beis HaMikdash become? Right? But that's the rule. Right? The rule is that for a korban tzibor, all the laws of Shabbos and Yom Tov are set aside. So be sure you understand this. When Beis Shammai says you can't bring an olah on Yom Tov, and Kal V'chomer Shabbos, but you can't bring an olah on Yom Tov, he means you can't bring a private olah on Yom Tov, and an olas re'iyah is a private offering because every family has to bring its own. But be it as it may, Beit Shammai's position is that Yom Tov only permits work for human consumption. It does not permit work for the consumption that goes to Hashem, the burning of a korban on the Mizbeach. That's Beit Shammai. Beis Hillel, on the other hand, makes a Kal V'chomer. And this Kal V'chomer is, if the Torah allows malacha for what goes into my stomach, Kal V'chomer, the Torah will allow malacha to bring a korban to Hashem. So on Shabbos you can't do it, because there's no heter, there's no Kal V'chomer. The Kal V'chomer is, if I could do malacha for me, I can certainly do malacha for Hashem. On Shabbos I can't do malacha for me, right? So again, two things. Everybody's moda, a shulamim can be brought on Yom Tov and not on Shabbos. And everybody's moda that the olah cannot be brought on Shabbos, unless it's a korban tzibor. The machlokes is, can an olas re'iyah be brought on Yom Tov? According to Beit Shammai, an olas re'iyah cannot be brought on Yom Tov because it's not ochel nefesh. According to Beis Hillel, an olas re'iyah can be brought. So frek the Rav Shulchan Aruch, frek the Balatanya. I understand why, according to Beit Shammai, the day after Shavuos would be a real chashuv day. Because all of the people who came to be Ola Regel for Shavuos have to bring, at least the men, have to bring an Olas Re'iyah. And according to Beit Shammai, they couldn't bring it on Yom Tov. So the first opportunity to bring the Olas Re'iyah would be Israelhag of Shavuos. So even though they do have 5 days after that, because you have a total of 7 days, but one can understand that the first opportunity would be very special. But according to Beis Hillel, this isn't the first opportunity. The first opportunity to bring the Olas Re'iyah is on Shavuos itself, on Yom Tov itself, because according to Beis Hillel, you can bring an Olas Re'iyah on Yom Tov. If that's so, there's nothing particularly special about the Israelhag. Yeah, it's a made-up day, a make-up day if you didn't bring it on the first day, but it's not your first opportunity. So why, in fact, even the words Yom Tavoach, the Magen Avraham calls Israelhag of Shavuos Yom Tavoach. the day of the slaughter of the Eilas Re'iyah. That very phrase, the Gemara says, is only how Beis Shammai describes the Israelhag of Shavuos. Beis Hillel does not even call it Yom Tavoach, because it's not, I mean, it is a day you could bring the Eilas Re'iyah, but the same thing is true for the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that. Elamai, its only chashivas is, it's the first opportunity. It's only the first opportunity according to Beit Shammai. It's not the first opportunity according to Beis Hillel. According to Beis Hillel, the first opportunity is Yom Tov proper. So why would the idea of Yom Tavoach and the corresponding chashivos of Israelhag b'Shvuos, why would that even be an issue at all according to Beis Hillel? And Verstetzach, as all of us know, when you have a machlokas, Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, except in some very, very rare cases, inevitably the halacha is like Beis Hillel, and indeed, in this case, we actually know the halacha is like Beis Hillel, that an olas re'iyah can be brought on Yom Tov, right? So what's the idea of Yom Tavoach? So the Shulchan Aruch Harav says the following strange teretz. He says, even though it's true that the halacha is like Beis Hillel, that people could have brought their olas re'iyah on Yom Tov, but Bizman HaMikdash, he says, Nagu Ha'am. The minhag ha'olam was to follow Beit Shammai in this matter and not bring the olas re'iyah on Yom Tov. Therefore, the Israelhag of Shavuos is elevated to a Yom Tavoach because it was the first opportunity based on the minhag that people had to bring the olas re'iyah. Nagu ha'am kebeit Shammai. Now, for the other Yomim Tovim, Israelhag was too late. Israelhag was more than 7 days, so afterwards, so you couldn't do it at all. But Israelhag of Shavuos became Yom Tavoach because Nagu ha'am. Nagu ha'am kidivrei Beit Shammai. Let me just finish the second sentence here. Now, the obvious, so this is what the Shulchan Aruch Harav says. Now, l'chayra, it's a pella. What do you mean, Nagu ha'am kebeit Shammai? We know, generally speaking, that if you have a machlekes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, you're not even supposed to follow Beis Shammai. If you remember, there's a Mishnah in the first parak of Brachos. There's a machlekes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. How do you fulfill the mitzvah of reading Shema? The Torah says, b'shachbacha, you read the Shema when you lie down, uva kumecha, and you read the Shema when you get up. According to Beis Shammai, this is taken very literally. Kriya Shema of Ma'ariv has to be recited when you're lying down. And Kriya Shema of the morning has to be recited when you're standing up. B'shachbacha uvekumecha. By the way, that would even be in Shul. So during Ma'ariv, right, when it's time for Shema, I lie down. Somebody says, hey, how can you lie down in the Beis Medrash? And this is what Beis Shammai says. For Kriya Shema, you lie down. Now, Beis Hillel says no. B'shachbacha uvekumecha does not mean you literally lie down or you literally stand up. It is defining the time of Shema. That there is a Shema you recite at a time when you normally would go to sleep, meaning nighttime. And there's a time of Shema that you recite when you normally are up, which is daytime, but it's not referring to lying down or standing up. It's a machlekes. In other words, how literal do you interpret b'shachbacha uvekumecha? So the Mishnah goes on and says that Rabbi Tarfon recounts, I was once walking on the road at night, and it was time for the Shema. So I wanted to be strict and follow Beit Shammai, because after all, Beis Hillel would acknowledge that you're yotzei with Beit Shammai. Beis Hillel says you don't have to lie down, but if you lie down, you're yotzei. So I lay down to fulfill Shema in accordance with Beis Shammai's view. And he says, I almost got killed by robbers attacking me because since I wasn't standing up, I couldn't defend myself. I was vulnerable. He says, I almost got killed because I wanted to follow Beit Shammai. Well, if Rav Tarfon thought he would get a sympathetic audience, they say, how bad it was. I guess he was disappointed. They kind of gave him tough love. And they said to him, you deserve to have your life endangered because you rejected the words of Beis Hillel. Meaning you're not supposed to go like Beis Shammai. Who do you think you are? The halacha is like Beis Hillel, and you don't have the right to lie down. So all of a sudden, in light of the idea that we're not really supposed to follow Beis Shammai, even if he's stricter, so what does the Shulchan Aruch Harav mean? That even though people could have brought the Olas Re'iyah on Yom Tov, the minhag was people brought it the day after Yom Tov, and therefore the Israelhag of Shavuos became Yom Tovah. How could that be? How could it be? Nagu ha'am, the minhag of people, was like Beit Shammai.
So, since Shammai was more about the position of of how you're doing it, and Hillel is more about the timing, does that mean that Shammai would have thought that if you slept in really late and you say you woke up at noon, that you would do it at noon?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's very, very clear from the halacha and from the Gemara that Beit Shammai is moda, that this is also encompassing a time frame, meaning it doesn't just mean whenever you lie down you can say the Shema, but he's saying that since the Torah didn't use the phrase day and night, but used the phrase when you lie down, when you get up, there's an additional element superimposed on the time that you have to physically position yourself. Yeah?
So I remember learning about this in the Yerushalmi and in, I think, Avot to Rabbi Natan. It's pretty clear that people, at least in Eretz Yisrael during the time of Chazal, had the practice to say Kriyat Shema at night while laying in bed.
While lying down.
To sleep.
Yeah.
So I was curious, does the Baal Tanya have a source for the claim that no one brought Allah on Shavuot? Because that's a pretty big claim that nobody in the Am did that, and it seems like he's just trying to justify what the Magen Avraham is saying.
Yeah, well, that seems to be it. I don't think he has a source directly. This is his hesber for the Magen Avraham, which itself will need some hesber. Yeah.
So some say when Mashiach comes, we'll ask him about Beit Shammai. So you're going to have to do that?
Well, if you follow the Kisvei Hari, it's from the Arizal, that Liyasid Lavai, the halacha is going to be like Beit Shammai, that would mean you're going to lie down. Yeah, you're going to lie down. Now, the halacha is you are Yotzei Shema, lying down. I mean, let's imagine, for example, you realize you didn't say Shema. Of course, if you didn't say Shema, you probably didn't have Shmoneh Esrei either, so you'd have to do that. But putting aside Shmoneh Esrei, you would be allowed to stay in bed. You'd have to either wash your hands or rub your hands on a piece of wood or something, because your hands have to be clean halachically. But you would be allowed to say Shema in bed. And in fact, in the morning, sometimes this is necessary. For example, if Shabbos davening, you're going to be late for Zman Kriya Shema, and you wake up and it's almost Sof Zman Kriya Shema, you might be well advised to say Shema, rub your hands and say Shema while you're even in bed. But the halakha is you can't do it when you're on your back. So it's interesting. So even when you're lying down, it has to be on your side. It can't be on your back. Yeah.
Even according to Beis Hillel regarding the Israelhag of Shavuos, who say that you can bring it for the entire week, they say that you can also bring it. I'm sorry. They say that you can bring it on Shavuos itself, but they say you can also bring.
Yes, that's true. That is true.
So that you don't need to rely on Beit Shammai. I don't see why.
No. The reason why it's relying on Beis Shammai is like this. It is true. You're 100% correct that it is true. Like Beis Hillel, you could bring it the whole week, but the day after Shavuos is no more important than the second day after Shavuos. Meaning, like Beit Shammai, the importance of the day after Shavuos is it's the first opportunity. Since, like Beis Hillel, it is not the first opportunity, it is just a opportunity, it is no more important than the day after that, or the day after that, or the day after that. So why, according to Beis Hillel, are you elevating the day after Shavuos? That's the issue. Like Beit Shammai, you're elevating it because it was the first opportunity and people wanted to do the mitzvah as early as they could. So the Baal Tanya's response is, the minhag was to follow Beit Shammai, and therefore it was elevated because it was the first opportunity, based on the minhag. Yeah?
Is Shammai telling us that we're supposed to bow before God while saying Shema, or is it just a...
I'm sorry, start again?
Is Shammai telling us that we're supposed to bow while saying Shema, or is it just to fulfill the pshat words of the Shema while saying it?
Well, It can't be bowing because lying down means you're in a bowing position, you mean? Yeah, but if that would be so, why would the day be different? In other words, it's very clear that he's not giving us a general way of saying Shema, because in the day you don't do that, right? So it must be to fulfill the literal meaning of the pasuk. Now, why would the Torah require that literalness? That's a good question. I'm not sure I know, but he says the Torah should have said, read the Shema bayom uvalayla, or laila uvayom, or erev avoker. Why does it use it in that way? So Beis Shammai says to teach me this extra halacha. Yeah.
A follow-up question: if you're supposed to say the Shema then lying down and sitting up, when in the Shema would you make the change?
Well, it never says sitting up. I mean, what does it say? It says b'shiftecha. Well, okay. All right, that's interesting. It says b'shiftecha b'veisecha, when you sit in your house, uvelechtecha v'derech, when you walk, b'shachpecha uvekumecha. So that's an interesting question that you're asking. There are actually four. I mean, once you're talking about positions, there are four positions that the Torah talks about. B'shiftecha b'veisecha, when you sit in your house. V'lechtecha v'derech, when you are walking in the way. B'shachbecha, when you're lying down. Uvekumecha, and when you get up. Now, Beis Hillel does not learn any of these are referring to any particular movement you have to do. But like Beit Shammai, you're asking a good question. Why does Beis Shammai only literalize, if there's such a word, I don't know if there is, why does he literalize only the last two and not the first two? Meaning, you could have made the argument, once Beis Shammai is saying you got to lie down and you got to stand up, so maybe you also have to have walking and sitting. It's a good question. You're asking me a question, but all I can tell you is, as an answer, Beit Shammai does not require sitting and he does not require walking. He only requires the last two. But why he only requires the last two is a good question. I'll think about it. I don't have a teretz for that right away. Yeah.
There's also a mafaka about whether Shema is biblical or rabbinic. So could that play into it, where the rabbis instituted using as a sort of they learned from that you should be doing it then. But nobody agrees that you need to say Shema when you're walking in the street.
Well, yeah, that's correct. Nobody possibly. In fact, the pashtus of the machlok is about Kriya Shema Deraisa Derabanan, only the first pasuk, etc. That's because the pashtus of the pasuk actually is, it's not talking about Shema at all. It's talking about learning Torah. Devar Ma'ela is the Torah should be with you always. When you walk in the street, when you sit in your house, when you go to sleep at night, when you wake up in the morning. In other words, the pashtus of the psukim, if you took it, lefi pshuto shel mikra, this is referring to divrei Torah. It is not referring automatically to the recitation of Shema. And then there are many, many opinions how much of Shema is deoraisa. Some say das yochid, that none of Shema is deoraisa. Some say only the first pasuk is the oraisa. Some say only the first parsha is the oraisa. And some say Shema and V'hayayim Shemoah are the oraisa. Vayomer Parsha Tzitzis is actually not part of Kriya Shema. Parsha Tzitzis is there for other reasons. So you have a whole potpourri of different opinions. How much of Kriya Shema is the oraisa? The Chag has a whole long arichas about the different shitos of the Rishonim on it. Yeah.
When you were explaining the case, let's say you're waking up late, you have to run to Shul on Shabbat.
Yeah.
And you have to say Shema. Do you have to say the Birkat, the Torah blessing before you say Shema?
All right. So here's the thing. It all depends. Lechatchila, you should say Birchas HaTorah before Kriya Shema. But if you're going to miss Zman Kriya Shema, if you say Birchas HaTorah, you should say Shema without Birchas HaTorah. Because since we're Choshesh, that Kriya Shema is a mitzvah d'oraisa, so you're not only allowed, you're chayav to do a mitzvah d'oraisa even without Birchas HaTorah. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind, that sometimes you may have to say Shema in bed, but do remember that if you are saying Shema in bed, you have to, and you don't have your negelvasser by your bed, because yeshiva doesn't allow it. So what you should do is you should rub your hands on the wall or on a piece of a wooden surface Because even though that doesn't, see, it's interesting. The washing your hands 3 times is a Kabbalistic idea to take away the spirit of impurity. But the halachic reason that your hands have to be clean for tefillah, you actually don't need the 3 times. You either need just a little water or rubbing your hands. But you still later, when you get out of bed, you still need to do the 3 times for ruach ra'ah. But the Pri Megadim says ruach ra'ah is not ma'akev in Torah and tefillah. That's an important yesod. Meaning, yeah, there's a spirit of impurity that Kabbalistically I should get rid of, but that does not stop me from learning and davening. But what stops me from learning and davening might be like the basic hygiene of scraping whatever gook is on your hands or whatever it is, and b'diavad, that could even be by a wooden surface. Yeah.
Doesn't Avarabah also mature you from the Birkot Torah?
Doesn't it what?
Avarabah. Doesn't it also mature you from Birkot Torah? So you could just...
Well, that's b'diavad. I mean, it is very true that the right. If you forgot to make Birchas HaTorah and you already davened Shachris, so Avarabah in the morning and Avas Olam at Ma'ariv actually covers you in Birchas HaTorah only if you make a point of learning some Torah right after Ma'ariv or Shachris. But that's only b'diavad, meaning to say, if you remembered you didn't recite Birchas HaTorah before you recited Avarabah, you certainly do have to recite Birchas. By the way, as an aside, I'm digressing here, but okay. As an aside, the Brisker Rav is a very, very interesting chiddush lahalacha, which makes a lot of sense. In fact, it's in a way it's so pashut that you wonder how can people not be machmer in this. He points out like this. As soon, let's say a kid is bar mitzvah, right? So a kid becomes bar mitzvah at night. The night of his 13th birthday, he's bar mitzvah. Seisa kachavim. Now the question becomes this. How can he learn Torah once it's night? You're not allowed to learn Torah without Birchas HaTorah. Well, the kid said Birchas HaTorah in the morning. So what's the problem? The same way I can learn at night, he can learn at night. No. When he said Birchas HaTorah in the morning, he was only 12 years old. He was a katan. And the same way a katan cannot be mitzi a gadol, a katan cannot make kiddush for me. A katan can't be mitzi himself. A mitzvah that he did when he was a katan cannot qualify as a mitzvah when he becomes a gadol. So that means, once it's night, the katan, who's now a gadol, shouldn't be allowed to learn Torah until he recites Birchas HaTorah again. Now, because the Brisker Rav, I'm not sure why, was a little mesupik, he didn't want to paskin that the gadol should make Birchas HaTorah mamish. He said the katan should not learn, well, I call him katan, the bar mitzvah boy should not learn Torah until he recites Ma'ariv, and he should be mechavein to be yaitse Birchas HaTorah with Avas Olam, and be sure to learn Torah right after Ma'ariv, and in that way he'll be covered. So that's actually an example where the Brisker Rav apparently uses the b'diavad eitzah even l'chatchila, because the Brisker Rav for some reason was mesupik. He didn't want to say that the kid should make Birchas HaTorah. Now, this does raise another interesting problem about davening Ma'ariv early. Let's talk about that a little bit. You're not Kriya Shema, because we're chayshesh at least, that Kriya Shema is a mitzvah d'oraisa. You're not yotzei Kriya Shema till Seisa Kochavim. Right? The star's coming out. Whatever that is, 42 minutes, 35 minutes, 72 minutes, whatever your shita is for Seisa Kochavim, that's a whole other limud. You're not yotzei Kriya Shema until then. What about Arvit itself, though? What about Birchais Kriya Shema and the Shmona Esrei of Arvis? Right? People daven early. People daven before sunset, or even in sunset before Tzeitzah Kachavim. So it's a complicated halacha, but the basic bottom line is that you can actually be Yotzei Arvis as early as Plag HaMincha. Now, Plag HaMincha is 1 1/4 halachic hours, let's say before Shkia. Now, halachic hours does not mean 60-minute hours, but it means halachic hours 1/12 of daylight from sunrise to sunset. So in the summer, an hour might be as much as 75 minutes, and in the winter, it might be as short as 45 minutes. Once you've defined your halachic hour, 1 1/4 of those units minus sunset is plag hamincha, and after that point, you're yotzei arvis. You're yotzei arvis. Now it's a little complicated. Some say that's only if you davened mincha before plag, then you can daven marv after plag. Otherwise, it's called contradiction, tarti desasre. Okay. So it turns out though that if I daven mincha, if I daven arvis early after plag, even though it's before shkia, I am yotzei the Shmona Esrei and even the blessings of Shema, but I will have to recite Shema over again afterwards, right? Because Shema, you have to do Tzeitzek Echavim. So, let's assume a kid is having a bar mitzvah, and it's Friday night, and that's his birthday, and they want to make an early Friday night minyan. And they daven arvit after plag hamincha. Can you do that? Although the minhag in Eretz Yisrael is not to, but mi'ikar din you can do that, okay? Like early minyan, early Shabbos minyan. I see that even in Eretz Yisrael, the American minhagim are penetrating. I know Rabbi Yashiv, Rabbi Shlomo Zalman are actually very against early Friday night minyanim because of Kiddush and other issues. But mi'ikar din, you are yotzei arvis that way. But says the Brisker Rav, a bar mitzvah boy should not daven an early ma'ariv on the day he becomes bar mitzvah. For a very simple reason. He's not going to be bar mitzvah until nightfall. The Amidah that he davened as a katan is not going to be valid for him when he becomes a gadol. So, two interesting chumras. One is the chumrah of Birkas HaTorah, that he should be mechaven to be yotzei with avas olam, and learn right afterwards. And the other is a bar mitzvah boy should not daven an early ma'ariv on the day that he becomes a bar mitzvah, because he's not going to be yotzei tefillah. Because when he becomes bar mitzvah that night, he's chayev in arvit. And he can't be yotzei with his arvit, because the arvit that he did from plag hamincha, he was still a katan. Very, very, very good horror. I've often said that, people think when they think of Rav Chaim and the Brisker Rav, they think of how deep their lumdus is and the like, which is true. But a lot of things, what people don't realize, a lot of things of Rav Chaim and Rav Eldel, the Brisker Rav, is they just notice a lot of things. They notice things. They see things. This is not a complicated observation. This is actually, once you hear it, it's like, hey, why didn't I think of that? So a lot of the godless of Brisk is you just have your eyes open to notice things that people don't notice, which is a tremendous koach. Yeah.
Does that mean that if someone, like a family, does do early Shabbat, they should have to wait to do Kiddush after it's 8 o'clock?
Yeah, that's the problem. Okay, so that's a separate issue, meaning that I was bringing in for a katan who becomes bar mitzvah. But the problem that the poskim have in Rav Shlomo Zalman and Rabbi Yashiv have with an early Shabbos is that even if you follow the position that you're yotzei arvit by plag hamincha, which we do paskin, and you'll say Kriya Shema again, but there's a very, very big shaila: are you yotzei kiddush before it's Tzeitzek Kochavim? Because kiddush is also a mitzvah d'oraisa, and even though the minhag in America is we assume that you are yotzei kiddush whenever you make it, that's a huge, huge machlokes. So it would appear, according to Rabbi Yashiv and Rav Shlomo Zalman, that as long as you're makbid not to make kiddush until Tzeitzek Kochavim, there wouldn't be that much of a problem with an early Shabbos. Other than the lechatchila inyan, that it's always better, really, to say Kriya Shema and the brachos bisman. But okay, but avada you would be yotzei by plag hamincha.
Like a lot of the minyanim now, they start like almost the earliest the early Mincha that they start on Friday, they start like almost an hour or an hour, at least an hour before.
Plug.
Yeah.
No, that's fine. That you have to do. Although, again, it's a machlokas. I mean, the heter, again, everything I say is a big machlokas, so that I'm not giving you every single shita. But generally speaking, the heter to daven arvit after plag hamincha, as long as you say Shema over again, after tzeis, is only if you davened mincha before plag hamincha. If you davened mincha after plag hamincha, then you would have to wait until either after sunset or maybe even after tzeis to daven mariv, because otherwise you have what is called tarte desasre, things that contradict. Because when you're davening mincha, you're treating it as day. When you're davening mariv, you're treating it as night. You can't treat the same period as both day and as night. That's called tarte desasre. Now you may remember from the old country, from the United States, that shuls have early minyanim, and for convenience, they like to have, on Shabbos, they like to have a uniform time, not to change the time every week. So they will maybe have it 6 o'clock throughout the summer. Now, that could create tremendous problems. First of all, in some weeks in the summer, that actually means you're davening arvis before plag hamincha. To daven arvis before plag hamincha is a bracha levatala mamish, and you're not yotzei. Not only would you have to say Shema again, you would have to say Ma'ariv again, and you're not. And you said bracha levatala. So that's problem number one. Problem number two is, even when they get arvis after plag, they're often doing mincha after plag. So they get into a problem of tarte desasre. So what you have to do when you're setting up a shul calendar for an early Shabbos minyan is you're going to have to vary the time a little bit every week so that mincha gets in before plag. So you would say, for example, mincha will be 15 minutes before plag. And then you can do Kabbalah Shabbos and Arvis afterwards. And then you'll have to do Shema later after Tzeis HaKochavim. Now, some say, but Tzibor, you're allowed to have Tarti Desasre, so even if Mincha was after Plag, you could do Arvis after Plag. But, okay, yes and no, okay, that's a machlokas. But the one thing that is unequivocal is, if you did Ma'ariv before Plag, you are absolutely in trouble. There's no machlokas about that. The only machlokas is, do we allow a Tarti Desasre if both are after Plag, and it's Tzibor, and it's Kavod Shabbos? So yesh makom lahakel, but that's not lechatchila. But don't confuse that. There is absolutely no dispensation for arvis before plag hamincha under any circumstances. Yeah.
I know. I think Rabbi Tom holds, or at least that you can say Shema and after plag hamincha. But I thought that no one really accepted that, and the actual machloka is about whether you could say the brachot of Shema after Shkia, but before Tzedek Rabbi, because to say Ma'amari Aravim before. Well,
you are correct. This is the great first Tosos in Shas, the first Tosos in Maseches Brachos, where Rabbeinu Tam is Machadesh, that the same way you could be Yotzei the Amida of Arvit after Plak HaMincha, you could even be Yotzei the Kriya Shema of Arvit after Plak HaMincha. And according to Rabbeinu Tam, there would be no chiyuv to say Shema over again at all. That's an amazing leniency, and you are also correct that we do not paskin like Rabbeinu Tam at all in that. But what you said is a machlokas, meaning, let's assume you have to say Shema over again. Are you still allowed to say the brachos? Meaning, some actually say you can only do the Amida without the brachos. But our minhag is, we do allow the Birchas Kriya Shema, meaning that even though you're not Yotzei Shema, the Birchas Kriya Shema are nigrar basar the tefillah.
If they're said before Shkia?
Even before Shkia. But you are correct that because this is a machlokas, this is yet another one of the reasons why Rav Yashiv and Rav Shlomo Zalman didn't like early Shabbos Minyanim, because they said you're putting yourself in the machlokas about Birchas Kriya Shema before Shkia. But as I say, Mi'ikar Adin, even before Shkia, you can say Birchas Kriya Shema, because Birchas Kriya Shema have a din of tefillah, even before Shkia. Yeah.
What do we, I mentioned we don't rely on halachti at all.
And Rabbeinu Tam? No.
Yeah.
Not on this one.
Yeah. So like, I guess like when people daven early,
They have to say Shema again?
If they don't, they're not Yotzei.
Well, that goes back to, I don't know what Hashem is going to say in Shema, meaning to say, you are mechuyev to read Shema again. Now, if you ask me the question, I forgot, was I Yotzei? So I said, you'll find out after 120 years. Like Rabbeinu Tam, you were Yotzei, so I assume that'll count for something in Shemayim. You know that the Rivash writes, just want to tell you something about this, the Rivash was one of the great poskim, writes that Rabbeinu Tam was extremely great. He said he considered Rabbeinu Tam greater than the Rambam, which is a big chiddush. And then he said, like he was almost afraid to say it, he says, and perhaps greater than the grandfather. The grandfather of Rabbeinu Tam is Rashi. The Rivash didn't even want to say it, but he said Rabbeinu Tam perhaps greater than the Zaidi, or the Saba, whatever. Yeah.
What's the reason for, if you say that, what's the reason for saying the Shema during the early morning if you need to say it after the end?
Yes, 100%. Very, very good question. If I'm doing it for Myra, but I'm going to have to say Shema over again anyway. So why am I saying it the first time? I'm not Yotzei unless you follow Rabbeinu Tam. That's a good question. So Rashi in Brachos actually brings the Yerushalmi that there's an inyan that we want to enter Shmona Esrei through Divrei Torah, just like we say Ashrei before Mincha. So Shema was the introduction to the Shmona Esrei, that you want to enter Tefillah mitoch Divrei Torah. That's the idea. And in Echinami, you're not Yotzei Kriya Shema.
As we know, at the time of Chag and Mincha, it's still the previous day, so after
Yep.
days,
Yep.
or the Shkia.
Yep.
And we see by example, like with the case of the Bar Mitzvah, that
It's still day.
even binding until
Right.
the next day.
Right.
So, what is the svara, I guess, that you can daven Marav at Chag and Mincha?
Yeah. So the svara was this. The svara was for tefillah, just for davening, not for Kriya Shema, except like Rabbeinu Tam, that it's not night, but since the tefillos match the cycle of korbanos, the Shachris is the Tamid of the morning, and Mincha is the Tamid of the afternoon, and Ma'ariv is the leftover fats that were burned at night. They started burning those leftover fats already in the later part of the afternoon, so the avoda of the night was already being done at that time. So for the tefillah, connected the korban, we consider that to belong to the night. Yeah.
Tefillas Ma'ariv is Makbila, the burning of the fats.
Yeah.
And if the burning of the fats happened could happen before Chag and Mincha, because Mincha could happen before Chag and Mincha. Why is it a problem?
It could, but mainly, as they say, in other words, in terms of the normal way it was done in the latter part of the day. Okay, we'll stop here. Take care.